Thank you so much. And thank you for this invitation to join this conference. I'm delighted to be here. I'm sorry that I've not been able to attend the talk so far, but I'm hoping to see more today. It is 5 a.m. here in Vancouver, and so there's what's outside my window right now. So the time difference, unfortunately, is somewhat extreme. But I'm going to, now that I am awake, I'm going to stay here for the rest of today. So my talk this morning represents really very new work. When I got the invitation, I had to think about the work that I've done on explanation, and I very much didn't want to just rehash things that I've already written. So I've started trying to amalgamate those older ideas that I had about explanation with some of the thoughts that have been occupying me lately around especially gender and the social and political impacts of gender on epistemic questions. And a lot of work has been done recently in that field, but not very much that I think is specific to explanation and the nature of explanation. And so I see a potential there for some interesting overlaps and intersections between two ongoing debates. So my hope is to sort of begin some dialogue about that intersection. And I am, as the title suggests, I'm going to take as my cue the idea of splaining, where that might be an abbreviation for mansplaining or white splaining or straight splaining. And I'll talk about these various kinds of neologisms, new words that were introduced to describe this phenomenon early in this talk, and then I'll get on to how I see possible connections with the nature of explanation and what it is. But the first thing to say, if I can just advance my slide here, is that yes, this is very much a work in progress, and I am presenting it here in order to really to get this project off the ground and to invite people to contribute and to give me some feedback on where the direction this project might take. This is by no means a completed piece of work. Okay. So I wanted to start with a brief history of splaining, and I have the quotes there because I want to talk about the words rather than the phenomenon at this point. I will come back to the phenomenon, obviously. So this word is a quite new word in English, and it appeared since 2000. It's been in use since 2008, when Rebecca Solnit published her very famous popular article called "Men Explain Things to Me," and she was describing in that piece an experience that she had of a man explaining her own book to her, without realizing that she had written it, I think, but certainly without caring about the fact that she had written it, and just assuming that he knew more about it than she did. Rebecca Solnit did not, in fact, coin the word mansplain, but a commentator on the social media site LiveJournal came up with the word mansplain to describe what happened to Solnit, and then it was taken up by, again, mostly initially in social media, so feminist bloggers and social networks started using the word. Started using the word to describe the kind of phenomenon that Solnit was talking about. And then it had entered mainstream usage certainly by the early 2010s, so quite shortly afterwards. So this kind of rapid uptake does suggest, I think, that there was clearly something there to name, and this word managed to capture it accurately in people's minds. So, for example, it became, the Macquarie Dictionary Word of the Year, etc. And that was in 2014. So you can tell that sort of during the 2010s, it has entered a very mainstream usage. The Macquarie definition of the word is, well, I want to say a few things about this definition, but the actual definition itself is to explain something to a woman. So this is the word mansplain now. To explain something to a woman in a way that is patronizing because it assumes that a woman will be ignorant of the subject matter. So some things that are interesting about this to me, Macquarie has decided that this is colloquial, perhaps because it is a neologism, or perhaps because of the abbreviation. And Macquarie also labels it as being humorous. So there's something amusing about saying that someone has mansplained. Well, I mean, we could perhaps come back to those questions later. But what happens then is that in the early to mid 2010s, the word mansplain gets extended to other kinds of terms. So, for example, we get quite early on white splaining, which is when white people explain racism to people of color. Here's dictionary.com. White splain is modeled after mansplain, and then splain has since become an affix signifying a patronizing, condescending explanation, usually given by a person in a privileged position. The word white splaining tends to be used in connection with explaining racism specifically. So whereas mansplaining was really used to mean men explaining something to women, could be anything, white splaining tended to be used for white people explaining racism, particularly to people of color. And then we got extensions like straight splaining, and here's Wiktionary's definition, a condescending explanation of something by a heterosexual to a non-heterosexual person. Here, Wiktionary has decided that this is informal, similar to Macquarie saying that mansplain was colloquial. Wiktionary also labels this as derogatory. So if you say that someone has been straight splaining, you are certainly criticizing them. It's not a compliment. All right. So putting all of this stuff together, I wanted to talk about or trying to capture some of the characterizing features of splaining. So I'm not now talking so much just about the word. I'm using all that information about the word, or rather the affix and the words that get made from that affix. I'm using all of that information to try to put together a picture of what the phenomenon is that those words seem to have accurately captured. So here we go. The reason the word is splain is because it involves explanations. And I will come back to the question of what exactly is meant by that very soon. But for now, we'll just say one characterizing feature of splaining is that an explanation is given. And it's important that it's given in a particular kind of social context. So it's given by someone in a position of relative privilege, that is to say, relative to the explainee, the person receiving the explanation. And the explanation itself is condescending or patronizing, or both, because it assumes the person receiving the explanation is ignorant relative to the person doing the explaining. There's a feature that I think should also go into this list, although it tends not to show up in many of the explicit definitions that I've mentioned, and others like them around these pieces of splaining vocabulary. And my thoughts about including this feature are inspired by and draw upon the work in feminist epistemology by especially Miranda Fricker, but many other scholars following her work and responding sometimes critically to her work. But what seems to me to be missing from those definitions is that the position of privilege from which the person giving the explanation speaks is defined by systemic and identity-based power relations. So it's not just any kind of privilege. These are the kinds of privilege that give rise to things like stereotypes, prejudices, and all the other sorts of things that we might associate with misogyny, sexism, racism, homophobia, ableism, any of those sorts of, or classism, any of those kinds of systemic identity-based isms. And I think that is important, and its influence is visible in the pattern of words that have this affix explain. So it tends to be associated with kinds of privilege that have those features. I can say more about that later if anybody wants to, but I'm going to press on for now. So when the definition or the characterizing features, let's say not a definition, that's too strong. When I say that the characterizing features of splaining include that an explanation is given, what am I talking about there? So in order to contextualize this part of the discussion, I will be talking about work that I've done and many others have done earlier on explanation in philosophical context, often in philosophy of science and sometimes metaphysics. So just to fill in a bit of the background, a bit of the context here, I take most 20th century analytic philosophical discussions of explanation to have focused on, or at least heavily featured, what they've referred to as scientific explanation. Sometimes that would be extended to include mathematical explanation, for example, and adjacent phenomena. In fact, the connection with mathematics is sort of how I got interested in the nature of explanation myself. But these were explanations that existed in certain fairly specific contexts. And what happened was that models or theories, they tended to be called models, but they often amounted to theories of explanation, were offered, including this sort of familiar list of types of models, deductive, phenomenological, etc. I don't need to run through all of these. I'm sure everyone here is quite familiar with these things. And ideas that emerged during the course of this discussion that became very central are that explanations answer why questions, most noticeably prominent in the work of Hempel and Van Frassen. I, in my 2008 paper, which is was at that point my best attempt to answer the question, what is an explanation? What I tried to do was talk about how what counts as an answer to a why question is actually an extremely variable and broad category, because you can answer a question in all kinds of ways. You can answer by doing something, you can answer with a sentence, you can answer with a proposition, you can answer sometimes even with an object. And so in lots of, I identify a few different sort of what I call dimensions of variations of explanations, but I try to associate all of them under this functional role. So it ends up being a functionalist account, the functional role being to answer why questions. However, in general parlance, explanation, the word explanation is used a lot more broadly, and we do give explanations of why things happen. We do use the word explanation that way outside of philosophical and scientific contexts, but it's also often used to talk about explaining how or explaining that, explaining what sometimes. And it's also used for other things like explication, which is, I'm just using it here to mean making clearer what was meant by a word or a concept. Exposition, so sometimes you say explain what goes on in Pride and Prejudice, and someone gives an exposition of the plot. It's sometimes used just to mean clarification, so explain that physics lecture that we just heard is usually a request to clarify what went on there. Sometimes explanation, the word explanation can even be used for excuses. When someone says, explain yourself, we're quite often asking for an excuse. And so this again comes from my earlier paper, but the etymology of explanation covers all of these cases and probably many more. And so explanare, the Latin word, just means to lay something out. A bit like a map. So if you unfold a map on a flat surface so you can see everything more clearly or more fully, or put things in context with one another, that act of laying something out on a flat surface is etymologically the origin of the word explanation. So what I suggested in 2008 is that why explanation is a particularly interesting, I'm quite ready to forward there, a particularly interesting or perhaps a particularly significant kind of explanation, because understanding how why explanation works would help us to understand those other categories. I still think that's probably true to a large extent, but I also think there's something to be said for thinking about explanation in terms that don't necessarily begin with why questions. And I will just pause that thread there for a second and come back to it in a moment. So all that's really to say, but for these purposes, I am treating of explanation, the word, and explanation, the practice and the phenomenon, in that more general sense, where it includes all of those other kinds of explanations as well. Although I do think the case of why explanation or explanations that answer why questions is interestingly central in understanding the phenomenon. Okay, so what I'm going to do now is bring in that second strand in this discussion that I wanted to bring into dialogue with those thoughts about explanation, and that is one that is indebted to the work of Miranda Fricke on epistemic injustice. And so here I'm drawing on Fricke's 2007 book in the first instance. So she was one of the earliest influences that brought this notion into, I would say popular, but at least philosophically popular view. And Fricke defines epistemic injustice as the kind of injustice that occurs when a subject is wronged, specifically in their capacity as a knower. So the best way, I think, to expand on what that is to just give the details of the two kinds of epistemic injustice that she identifies in that book. So the first kind is testimonial injustice, when a speaker is not afforded sufficient credibility. So one assumes that certain kinds of speakers are insufficiently credible. You wrong them in their capacity as knowers. You assume that they don't know as much as they do, etc. The other kind that she talks about is hermeneutical epistemic injustice, which is about the poverty of conceptual resources. So, for example, when an oppressed group of people doesn't have the vocabulary or the conceptual resources even to describe their own oppression, they are unable to formulate and even perhaps correctly know what the situation that they're being, the oppressive situation that they're in truly amounts to. And this is a different kind of epistemic injustice, according to Fricke. So I'm not going to be talking much about hermeneutical injustice here because it's less relevant than the testimonial kind. I will talk about testimonial injustice in connection with splaining and explaining. But first, I wanted to bring in another much later development. So Audrey Yap in 2017 paper adds more information that I think is important to this notion of testimonial injustice. So Yap points out correctly that testimonial injustice occurs when there is a credibility deficit as a result of identity prejudicial stereotypes. So that much is in Fricker's work. So for example, when we assume that women don't know enough or don't know as much as men do, so we don't give them sufficient credibility, that's credibility deficit as a result of identity prejudicial stereotypes. So Yap goes on to say, though, criticisms of Fricker pointed out that credibility is part of a more complex system that includes both deficits and excesses. So Fricker notes that it would also be possible to give someone a credibility excess. So you assume that they are more credible, or that they know more than they really do, that they are better knowers than they really are. That would be a credibility excess. And Fricker claims that that's not a way of wronging the person that you attribute the credibility excess to. The only way to harm someone is to accord them insufficient credibility. And Yap, I think, correctly points out that really these are flip sides of the same coin. And I mean, certainly when you think about it, it's possible to harm someone with a credibility excess if doing that means that the person is barred from learning things that they needed to learn because they think they already know everything that they need to know, because everyone's constantly giving them the impression that they already know everything they need to know, i.e. credibility excess. Okay, so taking Yap's point and bearing that in mind, we'll be able to think about this notion of what I called explanatory injustice. So I'm just sort of kind of mushing together ideas about epistemic injustice with these ideas about splaining that I talked about earlier in the talk. And so here I want to get back to the question of what it is that explanations do. And so the reason why I think the why case has been central and still is central in understanding what explanations do is because they kind of make as clear as possible that an explanation in a lot of central cases is an attempt to provide more than knowledge, or something different from just knowledge, which is understanding. So an explanation typically aims to make something possible to understand, or maybe easier to understand for its recipient. And the question of just what exactly counts as understanding here is itself fraught, and I don't intend to try to solve that here. But I hope it's relatively uncontroversial to say that understanding something is not the same as simply knowing that it occurs. And it may not even be the same as knowing that it occurs plus knowing some other facts. There may be a different kind of mental state involved in understanding, one that is specifically and distinctively connected with explanations. And I think why questions just make it as obvious as possible that one is seeking to understand a phenomenon or a situation rather than merely be told more facts about it. Okay. So typically, the people who do explaining, the people who give explanations include experts, adults, teachers, etc. And they're typically explaining. Experts explain things to novices, adults explain things to children, and teachers explain things to students, etc. And this list, I think, makes clear there is typically a power differential involved in the giving and receiving of explanations. Now, in those cases, that's not necessarily any kind of problem, right? There's no problem that teachers are in a position of power relative to their students and that they give explanations to their students, for example. And the same thing you might think applies to parents with children, or adults or caregivers with children, and experts with novices. That all might be fine. But that just the existence of that power relationship leaves this kind of context where explanations are sought and given open to the kind of problematic use that is represented by splaining. And so you think about the the assumption behind an act of splaining, whether it's mansplaining or white-splaining or whatever else, the assumption that's being made there is, I will give this explanation because you do not understand this and I do. And the part of the picture that I wanted to add in to those typical definitions is that assumption in the splaining case is not based on the fact that I'm a teacher and the person I'm explaining to is a student, or the fact that I'm an expert and the person I'm explaining to is a novice and I'm helping, but it is based on systemic and identity-based prejudice. So that's where I'm importing that part of Fricker's notion of epistemic injustice. The act of splaining, I just want to add here, so let's take it, I think this is fair, it's a wrong thing to do, to splain. We can see this in some of those definitions mentioned that splain is a derogatory term, and all of them, I think, make it clear that splaining includes some morally criticizable elements, such as being patronizing. And so let's say the act of splaining is morally wrong. Perhaps it's offensive, it promotes injustice, perhaps it reinforces stereotypes, etc. But I want to say it also exhibits epistemic injustice in that it wrongs people specifically in an epistemic capacity. But, and here's the part where I think I might need to tweak Fricker's notion of epistemic injustice. I'm not sure it wrongs people specifically in their capacity as knowers, so much as in their capacity as understanders, or perhaps it's just that the capacities in which they're being wronged that capacity needs to be expanded to include understanding as well as knowing. Okay, so what I'm trying to say here in fewer words is that splaining seems to me to exhibit a kind of epistemic injustice that is not testimonial or hermeneutical in Fricker's senses of those terms, and indeed may not be a kind of wronging of someone in their capacity as a knower per se. So let me get to that piece by piece. So it's not hermeneutical injustice because I don't think poverty of conceptual resources in shared language is the issue. This is not necessarily a matter of people being unable to identify or describe oppressive situations that they find themselves in. But it also doesn't seem to me that this is quite a matter of testimonial injustice, because the person receiving the splaining, the splainee, is not testifying. So there is nothing to believe or disbelieve about what that person is saying. That person isn't saying anything. So rather, what is happening is that an assumption is being made that certain kinds of people are ignorant or lack either knowledge or understanding or some other epistemically significant thing as a result of systemic prejudice. But I don't think this is exactly the same as a credibility deficit. I think it's related. And the same thing goes for assuming one is better informed than the splainee, right? This is a bit like what when Yap was talking about credibility excesses, that is, I think, very similar to what happens in the case of splaining, where one assumes one's better informed or better placed as a result of, better epistemically placed as a result of systemic privilege. But again, it's not quite the same as credibility, because there's not so far any testimony to credit or discredit. And the act of splaining itself is distinctive in a few ways that I also want to call attention to. So the act of splaining is not the same as making the background assumption. So just because I've made an assumption to the effect that this person doesn't understand something, and I do, and I have, let's say, in fact, made that assumption on the basis of identity-based systemic prejudices, I don't have to then go on and give the splaining. I don't have to do the splaining just because I've made the assumption. And I think this this is one of the features of explanation that has always interested me, the fact that there are these different ontological categories into which an explanation can be placed. That there's the act of explaining considered separately from the proposition or the sentences or whatever that constitute the explanation in some other sense. So I think that's one of the act of splaining is one of the distinctive elements of splaining that I want to think more about. I also think, and this is the part where I'm most currently in the dark and would most welcome input at this point, the epistemic involvement of understanding rather than simply knowledge is potentially intriguing and worth further inquiry, especially because this is the part that I think has the potential to show something really interesting and novel about epistemic injustice. Because so far the idea of, and I mean, I think this is honestly just a small microcosm of something that happens in epistemology much more generally. So in epistemology more generally, there is this tendency to assume that knowledge is the central category, and knowing, we need to have, it's no longer very fashionable to think we have to have an analysis of conceptual analysis of knowledge, but there is still quite a strong trend to think that knowledge is first in some sense, a la Timothy Williamson, and that other categories like justification are secondary, and that those are things we need to understand on the way to understanding knowledge, and that's the business of epistemology. And the role of understanding in all of that tends to be rather sidelined or made rather secondary. And I think that can be one of the useful things that I think one of the salient correctives of the literature on explanation is that it helps us to see that understanding is also very significant, and I would say another central epistemic category. So here again, in this case, if we want to understand epistemic injustice in its entirety, I think it's worth understanding the role of understanding in epistemic injustice. And so in the case of splaining, I think because we are looking at a phenomenon that is, how am I going to put this? It's a folk term. It's a common parlance term. It's not going to be anything as precise or clean or tidy as the analytic philosophy tends to enjoy things to be. But I do think that there is really something to be said for the importance of understanding, or rather, giving people credit for understanding what they do or failing to do that in splaining cases. So for example, when, let's go back to the original Solnit case, when the man explains Rebecca Solnit's book to her, he is taking himself to understand the thesis and to understand the content of the book, and taking her not to, and is trying to share that understanding in much the same way that a teacher might share understanding or try to share understanding with a student. And that sets up the inappropriateness of that assumption is the potential for it, the conditions for it are set perfectly by the background power dynamic of the patriarchy. Okay, so I think I will pause there and say this is the part of the talk where I'm hoping people will be willing to help me think more about this, and specifically to think about all of you here are experts on the nature of explanation, and so what I'd really appreciate is more help with thinking about how the specific features, the characterizing features of explanation could be usefully contextualized within this broader notion of epistemic injustice, so as to throw more light on the full range of epistemic injustices out there, where those may include ones in which one's wronged in one's capacity, not just as a knower, but also as an understander. And I will pause there. Thanks so much again for this invitation, and thanks everyone for listening.
Thank you. Okay, so we have plenty of time for questions. So as yesterday, you can raise your hands with the emoticon. Okay. Oh, we have plenty of questions. So let's start with Isaac.
Hi, thanks very much. That was really interesting. So I had two questions, but the second one was less well formed, but it was more relevant. It was more related to the last thing you were talking about. So I'll do my best to ask that one.
I appreciate that. Thanks.
I was wondering.